So will you pray with me? God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations on all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In 1992, a man by the name of Gary Chapman published a book called The 5 Love Languages. Anybody in here read it? All right. It's a book that's used for premarital counseling to help couples think about how to keep the love between them alive after the initial honeymoon phase. Not that I have any personal interest in that right now. So Chapman's been educated in primarily theological and biblically conservative institutions, and by virtue of that, by vice of that, he primarily focuses on heterosexual relationships, and so his views on gender and behavior, as many of us figured out yesterday when we were taking the quiz, are annoyingly narrow. Okay? But for the purposes of this sermon, I'm going to put that narrowness aside and hold on to a key claim in his book, and that is that each and every one of us has a primary love language. Now, the term language might be misleading, right? You might be thinking, oh, right, like some of us want to hear, I love you, and some of us like to hear, oh, you look beautiful tonight, honey, and other of us want to hear, you're the one for me. But Chapman isn't using language here in the grammatical or the linguistic or the semantic sense. He says that there are 5 languages of embodied love, that each of us have a primary preference for one, a deep need for one. And those 5 languages are physical touch, quality time, words of affirmation, receiving gifts, and acts of service. He's basically saying that all of us seek, need, or crave one of these in a big way, and that in order for us to feel loved, that particular love language, no matter what it is, must be employed and deployed by those closest to us. Now, his list might seem incomplete to you. It does to me. And this particular framework might seem overly simplistic and formulaic when it comes to making relationships work. It certainly does to me. But I think there's something important about what his ideas motivate or perhaps highlight if you read between the lines. And that is this: well-intentioned as some of us might be, as much as we hope that our love is obvious to those that we do in fact love, there's often a gulf between how we feel and what plays out between us. Anybody relate to that at all? Yeah, okay. Like, if you're partnered with somebody whose primary love language is acts of service, but you're constantly trying to show your affection by giving that person gifts, it's like no good, right? If a person wants you to do the dishes, but you keep bringing home roses, you're eventually going to sleep on the couch. All right? So this may seem overly obvious, but it's actually amazing how often we try to show affection to people by expressing love in the ways that we best receive love, which often doesn't translate because no two people are the same. We often receive love in very different ways. So that can sometimes trip us up, but it can also be a reason for us to work really hard at getting to know each other better. So there's like an adventure to it. I want to tell a story about something that happened in my early 20s to identify this dynamic of loving people in the way that we often want to be loved, as opposed to loving people in the way that they need to be loved. So I dated this person who loved to go fishing, was like obsessed with fishing. And I'd go with this person to the lake and, get out on the boat from time to time, but it was more like moral support on my part. Like I had no love for the hobby. Like none, okay? Boring, No offense to any fishers, but anyway. So for my 20th birthday, this person got all kinds of excited about the birthday present that I was about to receive and talked for a month in advance about how amazing this gift was, how much money it took, and how I was going to love it so, so much. And so, of course, my excitement grows and grows because of this hype that I'm getting for a month before my birthday. And then I open a top-of-the-line fishing pole. And you can imagine my disappointment, right? This is clearly a gift that my partner would have wanted, not one that I wanted. So I tell this story not to throw shade on that person, because God knows I've given gifts from a self-centered place, and we were in our 20s. But I'm just highlighting this dynamic. When giving love or expressing love or enacting love, many of us think first of what would feel good and right and true to us, and then we try to love others from that place. But Chapman is arguing that what love feels like to us might not translate to what love feels like for the other. And that our job in relationships of meaning and substance, and the relationships that we hold most near and dear, our job is to learn the love language of the other. And not just to learn it, but to speak it, even if it doesn't come naturally to us. So, I'm going to name those 5 things again, all right? Physical touch, quality time, words of affirmation, receiving gifts, and acts of service. Think about it for a second. Which one do you think you need the most in order to feel loved? And what about the people closest to you? Do you know which one they need to feel loved? And what about the people in this room that you've come to know and love in the fellowship of God? Do you think you know which ones they prefer? If you want to find out, go to Facebook. Whoa. We took quizzes. We did. You can add your answers. It's good. It's good for community. It's good public knowledge. So, this question of "do you love me?" is at the center of our biblical text for today. It's an exchange between Jesus and Peter, and it happens how many times? 3, yeah. And many biblical scholars posit that the 3-part sequence of this story parallels the earlier 3-part sequence of Peter's betrayal when Jesus is being crucified, that Jesus is giving Peter 3 chances post-resurrection to make up for his 3 denials pre-crucifixion. And I love the idea that God affords us equal opportunity to mess up and to make it right. Truly, I thank God for that, given my past. But there's more to this story than Peter's redemption. The story is about God's love language. The story is about God's love language. So notice who is asking the question. Who asks the question? Jesus, that's right. Jesus is asking the question. This is the incarnate God we are talking about here. God is asking the question, do you love me? So I don't know about you, but I spend a whole lot of time walking around wondering if God loves me, but I don't think I've ever envisioned that scenario flipped. Can you imagine how Peter must have felt? There's no more intimate question than that one. And yet here Peter is, hard-headed, mistake maker, betrayer, and chosen friend, loyal leader, lover of Jesus, being asked by God, do you love me? And not just once, 3 times. I don't care who you are, you'd probably start squirming after the 2nd time, right? So by the 3rd time, Peter gets hurt. And what he says from his pain makes clear a huge assumption that he's carrying around. Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Peter assumes that Jesus knows everything. This is definitely a theme that runs through John's gospel, this notion of an all-knowing God. In classical theology, this all-knowing capacity of God is referred to as omniscience. Omni for all or universal, and scientia as knowledge, omniscience. God is omniscient because God knows all things. Whether or not God knows all things is not an issue to me. What's at issue here is Peter's assumption versus what Jesus actually says. Every time the question is asked, it's followed up by a direct command to feed and tend to Jesus' sheep. Jesus seems to be saying that there's no knowing of love without the corresponding actions of love. I think this is what gets many of us tripped up in relationships. We assume that just because we feel love inside for someone, that it must be obvious in the world. We assume that others are omniscient in a way, that they know our love just because we feel our love. But Gary Chapman and the post-resurrection Jesus offer a corrective to that assumption. There is no love without action that's concrete and specific to the person you love. We can't stop at feeling. The call is to action. And again, not just any action, but action rooted in the specific love language of the person or community in question. So for the purposes of today, I'd like to offer that this text is a huge gift, not just to Peter, but to all Christians. Because God tells us what God's love language is in this passage. So here's the quiz. Did anybody get it? Who? What is it? Acts of service. Very good. You get an A. So it says it in chapter 21, plain, God feels loved when we are of service to others. The ethic of service is what enables us to make concrete our love for God. So I want us to think about this in two ways. The first, how often do you personally get involved in service work? When was the last time you got out of yourself and did the work of feeding and tending to God's people? And just in case it's not clear, God's people means all people. Okay? And I'm not going to spend much time on that first question. I happen to know that a lot of the people in this room do service for a living. There are lots of social workers and teachers and community activists and childcare providers and civil servants in this room that have dedicated your lives to serving others. And that's not to mention all the ways that you serve each other in church and the way you serve your families at home and your friends in the world. And besides, we're in the Midwest. Y'all make a way of life with service. It's like you're the most deeply communitarian and hardworking people in the world. And I've been in other places, so I'm saying that with authority, right? So I'm not too worried about the first question. I think many of you are of service, all right? But I do wonder about the second question, and that's this. When you are of service, do you take the intentional time to place that service into the category of loving God? Could you see yourself fulfilling God's love language every time you feed a hungry mouth, or care for a sick soul, or love a child, or write a grant of a worthy cause, or show up to support a friend in need, or touch a lonely shoulder, or have compassion on someone who is grieving? I think it's easy to do all that stuff and see the positive impact it has on the people you're showing up for directly. But can you place that service, that love, in the context of God's life, in the context of God's relationship with you? I want to challenge everyone in this room to envision God asking you, do you love me? And to accept that every time you show up in service, no matter how large or small, whether you're changing the diaper of your kid or picking up a piece of trash off the floor or running a nonprofit that assists the poor, your service is your yes to God's question. When God asks, do you love me? Your service is your yes. Try that framing out. Try it for a week. And see if it doesn't shift the intensity of your spiritual connection. And speaking of connection, I don't want anyone walking out of here thinking that I'm saying that our love for God and our love for humans are different. They're not. The text of this story tells us in no uncertain terms that our love for God is made most concrete through our love of humans. But you know what's not certain? How best to love the humans in our lives, right? So as I said earlier, we often make two big mistakes here. We assume just because we feel love for people, that the people we love know we love them. And that's not true. And the second is that we often love people by expressing love to them in the ways that we most appreciate being loved, which often doesn't translate. Okay? So this is a conundrum. If loving others is how we love God, and loving God mandates that we love others, how do we move past these very human tendencies to mess up love? So it doesn't hurt to ask a person, what can I do to make you feel loved? And then to do it. Right? So there's that. But there's another, perhaps more tender and scary thing. You could provoke a person into understanding by asking the question, do you love me? And when you're really, really sure they're listening, you might dare to trust. You might run the risk of letting that person know just exactly what you need. Can you be that honest? Can you wager that degree of potential rejection and freedom? Can you give another person that much power? The power to love you concretely, specifically on your terms? Can you put your own language of love in someone else's hands and make your heart subject to all the potential joy and pain, loss and novelty that person is capable of? That's what God did with Peter. That's what God did with Peter. That level of vulnerability. That level of giving power over. That's what our God did. And that's what our God calls us to do with each other. It's not a feeling. It's not a knowing. It's a doing. Will you do it?